This lesson is about the French present tense, or le présent de l'indicatif. Now, more often than not, the present tense is underestimated by students who don't pay enough attention to it, and that's why this video is super important. The first thing we're going to look at is when we use the present tense. In French, it's pretty simple. There's only one present tense, as opposed to English, which has two, the simple present and the present continuous, as you can see here. The present tense is used to refer to an action or a description that occurs in the present. Now let's look at the forms. There are three verb groups in French, and for this lesson we separated the irregular verbs to make things simpler for you. Now, you can learn verbs in many different ways, but my advice to you is to practice using the verbs as often as you can. That's the best way, in my opinion. Now let's look at the present tense of regular verbs and group 1 verbs, which are ER verbs like parler. As you can see here, parler is an ER verb, like many other verbs. It will take the forms that are put here in red. Je will take an E, je parle. Tu will take ES, tu parles. Il, elle, on parle. Nous parlons, vous parlez. Il and elle parlent. Notice how je, tu, the first, the second, the third, and the last forms are pronounced exactly the same, and it is true for all ER verbs. Now, it's easy. You take any ER verbs that you know and you apply the rules. You use the endings in red here for each person in red, okay? And you apply this rule and you will not be mistaken, you will not go wrong. Remember that the first, second, third, and the last forms are pronounced exactly the same. Now, let's note that if the subject you use in the sentence is a person, an animal, a thing, the verb is conjugated exactly in the same way as for il, elle, on. And for that, we're going to look at a few examples. Here you have je mange une pomme, Pierre mange une pomme, il mange une pomme. Now, in the first sentence, this is first person sentence. In the second and third example, we have third person. Pierre is a noun, and the ending is exactly the same as for il. It's an E. Let's look at further examples here. Parler for je becomes je parle. Écouter for tu becomes tu écoutes with the ES as we saw before. Manger, il mange. Travailler, la fille travaille. Again here, la fille is third person. It's like elle travaille, la fille travaille. Regardez, nous regardons. Sauter, vous sautez. Monter, elle monte. Voyager, mes parents voyagent. Mes parents is like il, ILS, the last person, okay, masculine plural, and you use ENT, just like L above. Now let's look at the other two groups, the IR verbs and the RE verbs. Finir is an IR verb, and like most IR verbs, the endings would be those that are put in red here. The same for RE verbs. As you can see, RE verbs, like vendre, will have no endings at all for the third person. So, finir will go je finis, tu finis, il, elle, on finit, nous finissons, vous finissez, ils finissent, and elles finissent. RE verbs, je vends, tu vends, il, elle, on vend, nous vendons, vous vendez, ils vendent. Unlike ER verbs, only the first, second, and third persons or forms are pronounced the same way. Now, there are only a few of those group 2 and 3 verbs, so you can learn them as you go. Now, let's have a look at a few of those IR verbs. Here is a list. that you may pick and choose and decide that you will remember them, or a list of RE verbs that you may want to pick and choose to remember. Here they are. And the last thing is irregular verbs. Now, irregular verbs also belong to one of those three groups, but the difference is that they are completely irregular. And here you have a list of the most common irregular verbs, which you will find very useful. You can look out for some patterns. For example, if you look at prendre, it is an RE verb. And the only difference is that the D in prendre disappears for nous, vous, and il and elle, the plural forms, right? And you can see also that for il and elle, prennent, you don't have a D and you have a double N. So look at them, maybe write them down somewhere and try to remember them because they are super, super important. Now, one last note about irregular verbs. The only tip you can get to remember verbs, and especially irregular verbs, is to use them regularly and look for patterns. For example, pouvoir and vouloir have the same endings for the first three persons. Je, tu, il, elle, and on. Vouloir becomes je veux, tu veux, il, elle, on veut. Pouvoir becomes je peux, tu peux, il, elle, on peut. Can you see how the EUX and the EUT is similar in both verbs? That's what I mean when I talk about patterns. Look out for patterns to help you remember the verbs. These are very, very important verbs. Now, you can rewind this video or do the exercises